Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of What the Dementia by Bambu Care. I'm your host, Brianna Wilson. I am a certified dementia practitioner and the founder of Bambu Care. So today's episode is actually a pretty quick one, but I think it's something that most people wish they knew the answer to, and that's how to change your partner living with dementia, how to change their behaviors, how they respond, all those types of things. People want to know, how can I do that? Is that even possible? Should I even do it? And so I'm going to give you a few insider tips on how you can change your person living with dementia. Now, just as a heads up, these may be things that you don't want to hear, but it's just kind of how it works. So, tip number one is that the change starts with you. There really is no direct way to change your person living with dementia, okay? And so a lot of people will gravitate towards medications, okay, as a way to alter their partner's behavior or mood or how they respond to things. But I really recommend that you kind of hold off on those types of interventions until you first try the tips that I'm going to give you, okay? So, like I said, tip number one is that the change starts with you. Now, you may have heard me say this before, but your approach is everything. Your approach really does set the tone for the interaction. So, what that means is that you essentially act as a mirror for your partner. You are giving them social cues on how they should also respond to a given situation. Because you have to remember that even when verbal communication fails, people living with dementia still are really good at picking up on nonverbal communication. And so, even if we don't feel like that's what we're communicating, it could be what they're picking up. So, if you approach your partner and you're very anxious, it could also make them anxious. If you're approaching your partner very angry, frustrated, short-tempered, well, then they may also be angry, frustrated, and short-tempered as well. But if you approach your partner in a good mood, they might also respond to you in a good mood as well. I want you to think of a time that you interacted with someone and they were kind of snippy with you, and you really didn't understand why they were snippy with you, but because they were snippy with you, it kind of made you snippy with them too. The same thing can happen when you're interacting with your partner living with dementia. They can simply be responding to the nonverbal cues that you're giving off, okay, to the emotions that you're displaying and the way you're behaving, okay? So I really want you to keep that in mind and try to be very mindful of how you choose to approach and interact with your partner, okay? Tip number two is that I really want you to be a dementia detective. I really want you to interact with your partner with intention, okay? And I call it intentional interactions. And the way that you do this is what I call the PANDA method. And this is actually my first time talking to you guys about this. And in future episodes, we'll go into more detail. But the PANDA method is essentially an intentional interaction framework. And so the P in PANDA stands for pause. A is assess. N is narrow. D is determine. And A is apply. Okay, now what I want you to keep in mind is that most behaviors that your partner displays is due to some unmet need. Okay, it's either an unmet need or it's an overmet need, meaning that, yeah, it's something that they need, but maybe they're getting way too much of it. And so now it's becoming overstimulating, it's becoming agitating, it's just simply too much. Or on the flip side, it could be an unmet need because they're not getting something that they need. Okay, but the only way that we're going to figure that out is if we play detective and if we're intentional about our interaction with our partner. okay? So when you're assessing what may be influencing your partner's behaviors, what you want to keep in mind are the impacts, okay? So you want to take in consideration the time. Is the time of the day a trigger for your partner? Humans, including yourself, any children or pets, is there someone in the household that is triggering for your partner? E is environment. Is there something in the environment that may be triggering? Okay. This includes, is the environment consistent? Is there good contrast? Are things accessible that need to be accessible? Is the environment safe? How about the lighting? How is the sound in the environment? What is the temperature like? So you want to keep all those things in mind. You also want to think, okay, well, do they have an infection? Is that what could be causing the behavior? So if you notice that there's a sudden change in behavior and that it's not the way that your partner would typically act, it could very well be an infection. And so you want to rule that out, whether it's taking them to the doctor and having them do a workup, a urine analysis, and all those things, or if you do an at-home UTI kit, okay? You want to just rule that out. You want to take into consideration if there's any medications that could be playing a role. So if your partner's already on medications, are they still effective? Has there been a recent medication change, whether a new medication was added or if they were taken off of a medication, especially if this change happened in, say, like the last 2 to 3 weeks? You also want to take into consideration pain, because when a person is in pain, they will behave a certain way. I know, like when I'm hurting, my patience is very thin, okay? And so pain can cause people to withdraw. It can cause them to be snappy and irritated and agitated and all types of things. So you want to make sure that if they're having pain, that the pain is being appropriately managed, whether it's through pain medications, whether it's through a heating pad or an ice pack or one of those pain creams or rubs, just something to make sure that the pain is being managed, okay? Another thing that you want to take into consideration, which I already talked about in tip 1, is your approach, because your approach is really everything. And even though we don't always want to admit it, it could be simply something that we're doing or saying that is causing our partner to behave the way that they're behaving, okay? Another thing you want to consider is continence. And so this includes continence, incontinence, and constipation. Okay? Because all of those can have different influences on behavior as far as them making it to the bathroom on time, urinating or defecating in odd places, okay? And also, if they're constipated, it can cause them to lose their appetite. It can cause them to be easily agitated, things like that. Okay, so you want to keep in mind those things. You also want to keep in mind their temperament. Okay, and a temperament is simply the typical way that the person behaves or responds to certain things. So, are they typically easygoing? Do they highly value their independence? Do they seek friendships? Do they need a lot of validation and reassurance? All those types of things. What is their natural temperament? And you also want to keep in mind that the temperament that they had before being diagnosed with dementia could be a little bit different now that they have dementia. So, knowing what their temperament was before may help you understand what their temperament is like now, but I also want you to keep in mind that it could change. Okay? And then you want to keep in mind their senses. Okay? So, when we talk about senses, of course, there are the 5 senses that most people are familiar with, which is sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. But there's also what's referred to as proprioception, which is the awareness of your body in space and how your body relates to other body parts. Okay, and then there's also vestibular sense, which is more of an inner ear thing. This is what kind of controls the balance, our spatial orientation, and kind of like the sense of where the body is in space altogether. Okay, and so you want to keep in mind that just like with normal aging, there are going to be changes in the person's senses. The only difference is instead of these changes being due to normal aging, the changes in the senses are now being caused by essentially brain damage, okay? But there will be a change in the person's senses. And with those changes will come a change in how the person is able to interpret their environment, okay? And make sense of the world around them. And so that is what I really want you to keep in mind, is that there are going to be impacts on your partner's behavior. And so it's your job as their partner to be a dementia detective and figure out what those impacts may be. Okay? So what I want you guys to remember is to be intentional with your interactions. Use the PANDA method: pause, assess, narrow, determine, apply. What you're assessing are the impacts: time, human, environments, infection, medication, pain, approach, continence, including continence, incontinence, and constipation, temperament, and senses. Once you determine what the impacts are, which keep in mind, guys, there are many things that could be impacting or influencing your partner's behavior. But once you figure out those things, you can narrow them down, right? And once you have a better understanding, it will give you better insight on how you may be able to intervene so that you're able to better meet whatever that unmet need is, or to find a better balance with anything that's maybe being overmet and overstimulating for your partner. Okay, so as a summary, the best way to change your partner's behavior is to start with yourself and changing how you approach your partner, and in being that dementia detective for your partner and figuring out what may be going on that is causing them to behave the way that they are. Okay? Because, guys, I know that sometimes it feels like they're doing things on purpose. And just like any human being, sometimes we do things to push other people's buttons, but oftentimes it's not intentional. And it's often just a reactionary response to their environment, to their attempts to interpret their environment and interact with it. Okay, so they're not doing these things on purpose. And I know that it can feel that way sometimes, guys, but I really want you to try to not take things so personal, because this is a long journey ahead. It really is. And if you can learn to adapt and adjust and see what you can do in changing how you interact with your partner first, I'm telling you, it will take you such a long way. Okay? So that's all I have for you guys in this episode. As I always say, I hope that this podcast was informative and that you learned something of value. If you have any questions, comments, or future podcast requests, you can always send us a voice message on whatthedementia.com, or you can send us an email at podcast@whatthedementia.com. Thank you so much for joining us on another episode of What the Dementia by Bambu Care. We look forward to catching you on the next episode. Take care, and until next time, stay strong, carry on, and remember, you are not alone. Bambu Care is always here.